Welcome to Cancer Lesson 2.1. What type of normal cell is most vulnerable to becoming a cancer cell, and why? The goals of this lesson are to introduce how the human body is organized into organs, tissues, and cells, and explore why epithelial cells are especially vulnerable to carcinogens. At the end of the lesson, the students should be able to describe the relationship of organs to tissues to cells, explain the function of epithelial cells within organs, explain why epithelial cells are particularly vulnerable to carcinogens, and explain why most cancers originate from epithelial cells. To achieve our goals, we will engage in a Socratic discussion and an activity on characterizing tissue structure. To prepare for this lesson, you'll need to review the following key scientific concepts that will be presented throughout the lesson. Each organ is made of two major types of tissues: the parenchyma, which performs the organ's function, and the stroma, which supports the organ's function. The parenchyma of many organs is formed from epithelial tissue. Epithelial cells line the organs and make up the skin. They sit between the environment on one side and the basement membrane on the other. The basement membrane lies next to the stroma. Because epithelial cells interact with the environment, they are vulnerable to carcinogens. In fact, the majority of cancers originate in epithelial tissue. You can review the scientific content in the background reading provided for you in the teacher primer, the teacher manual, and the student workbook. The teacher primer provides in-depth knowledge about the scientific content presented in this lesson. The teacher manual or lesson plan provides a minute-by-minute explanation of the lesson structure, and the student workbook provides additional explanation for students. Be sure to print the lesson worksheet and the homework worksheet. You will also need the homework video, which can be found in the Lesson 2.1 PowerPoint. The key points of the do now are that each organ has a specialized function and that the specialization of organs requires specialization of tissues. We'll get there by reviewing the functions of different organs. In the do now, students are asked to report the different functions of the different organ systems. The key points of the discussion are that the parenchyma is often made of epithelial cells that are exposed to the environment and vulnerable to carcinogens, and that the epithelial parenchyma from different organs can develop similar types of cancer. First, we discuss how organs are made of tissues, which are made of cells, and that these tissues can perform a variety of specific functions, but there are two major tissues that each organ is made of: the parenchyma, which is the tissue that performs organ function, and the stroma, which is the tissue that supports organ function. Next, we move on to discussing how tissues often form tubes, such as the esophagus, which is part of the GI tract. The main function of the esophagus is to move food from the mouth to the stomach. The tissue that performs this role is the parenchyma tissue, which in this case is the inner lining of the GI tract. The parenchyma is sandwiched between the inner space or lumen of the GI tract, which in this picture is above the parenchyma, and the stroma, which sits below the parenchyma. The stroma supports the parenchyma. In this case, the stroma contains blood vessels that provide oxygen and nutrients and connective tissue that provide structure to the parenchymal tube cells. Other tissues, such as breast tissue, also form tubes with a lumen, functional parenchyma, and supportive stroma. Next, we take a closer look into the structure of different organ systems to identify parenchyma and stroma. Using the analogy of different types of people in a community, different cells make up tissues. The type of cells that form parenchyma tissue reflect the function of the organ. Hence, the parenchyma tissue of the heart is made of muscle cells because the main function of the heart is to pump blood. The parenchyma tissue of many organs is formed from epithelial cells. This is important because epithelial cells contact the environment and are vulnerable to carcinogens. The parenchyma of the esophagus is made of epithelial cells that sit below the lumen of the GI tract and above the stroma. They are separated from the stroma by the basement membrane. the basement membrane stops the epithelial cells from moving into the stroma. The distinct functions of the four major types of epithelial cells are now discussed. Squamous epithelial cells, cuboidal epithelial cells, columnar epithelial cells, and transitional epithelial cells. Note the position of the basement membrane that separates the parenchyma and the stroma. In normal tissue, parenchyma never passes into the stroma. How does all this relate to cancer? Because epithelial cells are exposed to the environment, they are vulnerable to carcinogens. In fact, the majority of cancers involve epithelial cells. Cancers are named differently depending on where they originate. Cancers of the epithelial cells are called carcinomas. A cancer occurs when a cell begins to behave independently of the rest of the cellular community. In the activity, students will work in small groups and examine the tissue images of various organs. They will have to correctly label and identify the lumen, parenchyma, basement membrane, and stroma. The key points of the activity are that different tissues have different organizations of cells. Epithelial cells in a tissue reflect the function of the tissue in the organ. For example, epithelial cells in the lung perform a different function from epithelial cells in the GI tract. And metastasis occurs when a tumor cell acquires the ability to pass through the basement membrane and into the stroma. Students will use the lesson worksheet to examine the organization and function of epithelial cells in 5 different tissues of the body. Then they consider what types of carcinogens these epithelial cells would be exposed to and explore the process of metastasis, which occurs when a tumor cell acquires the ability to pass through the basement membrane and into the stroma. The key points of the wrap-up are that epithelial cells are the most exposed to the environment and to carcinogens. Epithelial cell tumors become cancerous when they become able to breach the basement membrane and enter the stroma. And knowing whether a tumor cell is at its site of origin or has metastasized is important for how it is treated. Epithelial cells are vulnerable to physical damage and infection as well as carcinogens. To heal after damage, they must replicate, but the more they replicate, the more likely they are to acquire mutations. Replicating in the presence of carcinogens makes mutation even more likely. Next, we take a closer look at a basal cell carcinoma. That is a cancer of skin epithelial cells. Basal cell carcinomas lose control of replication. However, they rarely gain the ability to breach the basement membrane. Hence, they rarely spread to other parts of the body or metastasize. Therefore, they are generally benign. We can compare basal cell carcinoma with a melanoma, which is also a carcinoma of skin cells. In contrast to basal cell carcinomas, melanomas commonly gain the ability to breach the basement membrane and metastasize. Melanomas are therefore often malignant. This comparison sets up the explanation of why it is important to know where in the body a cancer has originated. For homework, students will watch a video on mitosis and answer questions on the homework worksheet. One of the most common challenges students have is how to delineate the parenchyma, basement membrane, and the stroma. Immediately next to the lumen is the parenchyma, which is followed by the basement membrane, which is followed by the stroma. Thus, the stroma and the lumen are farthest apart from each other. At the end of the lesson, collect the lesson worksheets to assess student explanations of the function of epithelial cells and why they are the most vulnerable to carcinogens. This lesson explained why most cancers arise from epithelial cells. Next, we will look at what can turn normal epithelial cells into tumors and then into cancers. Don't forget, if you have any questions, concerns, or feedback, to let us know. You can contact any of the CTSE team members and we'll be happy to help you.